Well, it's important, isn't it? I think that we are aware of what our rules of social interaction are, both individually with others and if we're in a group or even belong to a group. I'm not sure as it's safe to belong to a group because a group tends to have authority over us as a condition of its membership. And that might clash with our values and, if you like, putting God first. Now, you could argue conceivably that, yes, we are to love God before all others, if you follow that rule. But that doesn't mean to say we can't comply with group requirements of interaction, how we talk and what we say to each other, how we behave. Except that if the group itself hasn't got your values, then you're likely to have a discord between what the group, if you like, requires of you and what you feel your God, I don't like to say requires, but how you should be relating to your God. So, for instance, fairly obvious sort of things, you might think a group shouldn't gossip behind other people's backs. We might query what we mean by gossip and in what circumstances and so on. But there's something about gossip that is considered pretty unacceptable. For instance, in Buddhism, it's thought to be an apparently minor bad thing to gossip, but it's indulged in so much by people that it may well be in total something that brings more harm than any other fault. What do we mean by gossip? Well, possibly anything that's said to someone about someone else that you wouldn't have wanted the someone else to know you've said. There's something secretive and harmful about. That's the essence of gossip. It's both hidden from certain individuals and is about them in some way, relative, I suppose we would say, to their welfare and what they would see as disadvantageous. They wouldn't want you to be thinking this or saying it. That's not a very clear definition, is it? But what do you think gossip means? Is it harmful? Is it something you would like not to be present? Okay, supposing now a group constantly does this. Should you be part of that group? Can you bring it up as an issue that the group needs to be clear on as you see it? Or will this be harmful? And if, in a sense, a group doesn't agree with you, or you don't agree with the group, should you remain deliberately exposing yourself to the group's influence by attending it? Now, some relationships you don't have the option. It's your employer, it's major. All right, then one says, well, should I be remaining in employment? And there may be all sorts of arguments as to why you're going to have to remain in that employment and let the requirements of the employment override, in a sense, what you think your relationship with God ideally is. You you'd like to keep away from gossip, but unfortunately you're working in a group that does have gossip going on. It is destructive as you see it, but you can't necessarily keep yourself away from the group because of that. In which case, what's your involvement in this aspect of the group that you don't like? Now, it's not just a group, is it? It might be your conversation with a particular person. You find they're gossiping, you don't want to. You find they tend to be doing that often. Should that start to come between you? In a sense, possibly yes, because you feel you're being a party to the gossip by your relationship with them. So then one might want to argue that one should be distancing yourself, whether it's a group or an individual. Right. There are other things rather like gossip. There's ways of talking and behaving that are harmful and you might feel are ungodly, and you don't want to be part of that or influenced by it. Should you therefore separate yourself from the individual or the group that tend to do this? There's a possibility, of course, that you can talk it over with the other party and then come round to your way of thinking that, yes, this is gossip, or this is, for instance, interrupting people and talking too much, or even as some people find certain behaviours are very unacceptable, like arriving too early they find annoying, or arriving late they find very annoying, or sitting in the best chair in the room they find very annoying. Now, are you willing to comply with their requirements or desires or not? And if not, will this cause some antagonism to build up between you? And would you believe it, but conceivably they end up quite your enemy because of non-compliance to what they value compared to what you value or really don't feel should be a concern. In other words, at what point do we let these issues affect our willingness to be part of each other's circle of relationships? I think it is an issue because, well, it's an issue if you want to put something else first. In this case, I'm thinking from a spiritual point of view. We may feel that, we should love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind and strength. And these issues can be found to compromise that goal. And then I suppose we feel rationally it's important to act accordingly and separate ourselves from people who are going to interfere with that. But in a sense, everyone's individuality interferes with our individuality wherever there is a difference in values. Now, we may fundamentally have the same values in the sense of, I assume anyway, we want life, we value life, we want consideration and help and kindness, and we value honesty and so on and so forth, and not gossiping. In other words, it might be, it's a question of how much compromise, if any. I mean, some fundamentalists, if you like, in a I'm thinking in a religious sense, but I'm also thinking generally, some people are very strict about things, and one would say are very controlling. Now, that sounds a negative, doesn't it? If they're controlling and it's in a way that we find unacceptable or problematic, is it right now to separate ourselves? The casual drift in the Jesus story is, let him be unto thee as a heathen man in certain circumstances. And I'm trying to think the circumstances in which Jesus says this. And therefore it may be specific to those circumstances, not generally. In other words, not necessarily what we should do in any discord situation. Because to be let him be unto you as a heathen man from the Jewish culture point of view, and we're pretty clear, meant you start to ostracize people. To the extent that, yes, if they're in dire straits, you help them like the Samaritan does. But you wouldn't normally have anything to do with this sort of person. But you do in serious cases of something that's very important to them, or at least where he's dying on the side of the road anyway, and you said all distancing aside for a moment and be a neighbour to. So there's a question of neighbourliness, which is desirable compromise, very desirable. You come to the rescue and help. And fellowship neighbourliness, where you're in a relationship of community. And I think it means, or rather turns on, something of trust. If you think of them as an enemy, and between Samaritans and Jews they were considered sort of enemies, you should treat them as a heathen man. Jesus wasn't treating the woman at the well as a heathen woman, even though she was a Samaritan and he was technically a Jew. You could say, well, that was because there was a very important, desperate thing at stake, namely her salvation. So he was reaching across, talking to her when a Jew would normally not have talked, would have treated her as a heathen woman. But Jesus is taking her spiritual state to be one of dire need, not knowing God, you see, in quite the way, we know God, for salvation is of the Jews, he's reportedly in the story to have said, which sounds very self-righteous in a way, doesn't it? And very dismissive. And you could say, well, it's in the scripture there, but not validly so. It's a fault. It's not valid, acceptable scripture. Or you could say, no, it's indication of how we should behave when with persons and groups that are, if you like, not God-centered in your very definite way. But he is identifying himself at that moment as being a Jew and member of a group, even though he obviously has tremendous issues when it comes to you scribes, Pharisees and hypocrites, who are definitely also identified as a member of that group of Jews, serious religious Jews. And he's presenting himself for a moment as part of such a group. Well, we may be demanding too much of the story, that no story can be perfect or complete. You just hope that there's an important, valuable point being made by the story, not that the story is perfect. So, I'm back on my track again, aren't I, of we shouldn't worship a story. Can I say I'm being on track? That's what I do like, and I've said before, haven't I, about YouTube, is the other person's always free to stop listening to you, flip out, and watch another YouTube, not yours. And there's something lovely about that, in that it gives them an independence, a freedom to be the person they want to be, not hounded or pressed by, for instance, me talking to them. They can simply say, look at it and say, well, don't like these sort of recordings, don't like the drift of what, Marshall's saying. I don't think I want to listen to that anymore, and stop. Whereas the man, and I was stopped yesterday in the street by an evangelist, so to speak, fundamentalist evangelist, very earnest and very, very misguided from my point of view, but, very earnest. I mean, I valued him, but he was such a storm of words that I couldn't interrupt, I couldn't get away from, I couldn't reply to. I could seldom finish a sentence without him charging in with another example of scripture that he feels steamrolly, validates his points yet again. And you just felt exhausted with this person, and he was not interested, quite honestly, in listening to me, and I was fast getting extremely exhausted listening to him. And really one should say, should one, I'm sorry, we don't have a meeting of minds. I think I need to bring this conversation to an end. I wouldn't like us to be enemies on disagreement, but we're not progressing in agreement as far as I can see. But I wouldn't have had time to make really that many words with him. And I appealed to him several times to let me speak, but if you like, it was to no avail. And after an hour or something, me battling away with him as I felt in the street, I just felt exhausted and got nowhere. And he was still ploughing on. So in the end I did terminate it, and I possibly didn't manage to terminate it in a best way, but it was the best I could sort of pull off at the time. And I got in the car, and that helped me to escape. I therefore drove off. I don't mean I drove over his foot or something, or shot off down the road at 90 miles an hour. I don't mean that, but gosh, I was not blessed by the interaction, you see. And in hindsight, I feel I should have terminated it earlier, when things were, well, they tend to get less civil, don't they, in those difficult situations. In the end, you start to be not behaving ideally back. And it's so similarly, I'm thinking, when you're in a group and there's gossip, and you think, this is very destructive, I don't think in total I should really be a part of this group. Perhaps you shouldn't. And perhaps that's going to make you very isolated as a person, because perhaps all groups suffer from this problem. Now, isolation's not good, it seems, for the human being, us, people. And for some animals it's not good at all. They're very much group and herd animals, aren't they? I'm not sure as I want to quite classify us as animals, but, perhaps we have great needs to be part of a group. And that's why religions tend to say you should be part of the fellowship, or you tend to go astray. And I think they're right, you do tend to go astray, but perhaps you should. Groups are not healthy, in fact. And then you come back and say, but hang on, much of our welfare and standard of living seems to unquestionably rely on membership of groups. You know, firms, businesses, employees, employer sort of relationships, and social groups and so on and so forth. That, you know, civilization is group interaction. And if you become a sadhu, you know, an ascetic, a recluse rather, specifically a recluse type of spiritual person, then, well, you might be okay if you really do have a good relationship with God, your God. Then I guess by definition you would be safe. But if not, you'd just be a lonely, isolated individual and much at risk. And that might not be the way to go. So I'm not definite or specific on what I think teaching should be, if teaching should even exist at all, but I'm not clear on the solution to the issues here. We obviously don't like gossip. We don't like people that don't observe, we don't like situations where people don't observe some equality of right to communicate and be heard, not just be forced to listen to. And in a sense, that's what I was concerned about with lectures and people that teach and gurus. They take a dominance that perhaps is not acceptable to someone who wants to love God first and foremost, you know, with all their heart, soul, mind and strength. In other words, they're going to shy away from membership with groups, from social activity more generally. You could say except with people who are very like themselves and probably in ones and twos at the most, because it starts to be a group that dominates you otherwise. And we don't wish to be dominated even by an individual, for we have our values, not his or hers. I'm going to stop here because I've been running for nearly 23 minutes. I just wanted to get those thoughts down. I think it's important. What do you think? And I do mean what do you think, because I'm not clear on the answer. I do know that gossip seems very destructive. I do know that talking too much in a group drives other people in the group balmy rather than blessing them. You know, perhaps we should have a great equality in mind, but an equality in mind with a large group means you're outnumbered. You might, you know, speak for 5 minutes in a group that lasts an hour, and therefore you're going to be overwhelmed by what, on average, the rest of the group do and discuss and so on. Is that acceptable to you? Is that the way you really want to go? You can't steer the group tends to steer you, because it's bigger than you, it's more powerful. You know, even in logical discourse, it somehow overwhelms because collectively the group is bigger than you. Do you therefore avoid groups? Could you and still be civilized and survive? And equally in individual relationships, is it right to treat someone as a heathen man, or is Jesus simply wrong in the story in doing this? I mean, if you're worshipping the story, then you have to say, no, Jesus is always right. But I don't think we go down that road. A fundamentalist does. And that's going to give you perhaps a fundamental discord between you and him. And therefore, in some sense, you can't go very deep because there's a deep cavern between the two of you. Could be. Well, it's an issue, but I don't necessarily know what the best solution is. But it does seem important, doesn't it? Thank you, Heavenly God. And thank you in what sense, Lord? In that these issues make us get to the heart of things, don't they? We think now, what is the best way of handling so-and-so? You know, we don't want to be too dogmatic and certain that we're right in the conclusions we come to, when there's a lot of uncertainty as to what's best. So we sort of limp on in the meantime, being not quite sure what's... But then we find better ways of handling it, perhaps, than simply exclusion. You know, exclusion's a bit like the murderous situation, isn't it? If I don't get on with you, my answer is to kill you, so that it's not a problem. And we find this extremely unacceptable socially and couldn't possibly be right with God, so to speak, you know. But then ostracism, you know, let him be unto thee as a heathen man. That can be a pretty dangerous outcome too, can't it? You know, we have a world in which we're not in harmony with the quotes heathen man that doesn't agree with you, basically. Is that a tolerable, is that a civilized way to live? Or have we misunderstood what Jesus meant by heathen man? He didn't mean, for instance, not helping you if you're in desperate need. You should be a neighbour. Ah. So perhaps we have a misunderstanding of what's being suggested in the story. Or perhaps the story is just wrong. Perhaps it's right in other ways. Uncertainty, it's 27 minutes now. Uncertainty addresses everything, doesn't it, in this world, and is a problem. But at the same time, it seems to be a great blessing to us, in that uncertainty, as I've said elsewhere, may give us that freedom to choose God without an obedience fear situation of his presence. And in uncertainty we find out whether a thing is something we truly wish to value or not. And hopefully, by the grace of God, progress on the path spiritually to heaven. Okay. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.